Okay, I think we'll go ahead and start. I have a couple of remarks to make anyway before the program actually gets underway. So good afternoon and welcome to the Hood Museum of Art's virtual public program series. I'm Sharon Reed, Programs and Events Coordinator for the Hood Museum of Art. And today we're excited to bring you a closer look. Lilly Martin Spencer's The Jolly Washerwoman, in which Bonnie MacAdam and Vivian Ladd will lead us through an in-depth exploration of this painting. Before we begin, I just have a couple of reminders. To enhance your experience, when Bonnie shares her screen, you should see a green bar at the top of your screen that says Bonnie is sharing her screen. To the right of that is a tab that reads Viewing Options. Click on that caret and select Side by Side, and this will allow you to view both the images and the speaker without them overlapping. And there is a horizontal bar that you can hover over, and you can move our thumbnails over to make the images prominent as you like, to your taste. Today's presentation will last approximately 45 minutes. We'll start today with a roughly 35-minute PowerPoint presentation. Then Bonnie and Vivian will lead us through an interpretive discussion of the work, followed by questions you may have. You may type a question at any time in the Q&A feature during the presentation, and we will, as always, do our best to get to as many questions as possible. The program is being recorded, and we will share the link on the Hood social media platforms after the fact, including on YouTube and the Hood Museum Stories and News page on our website. And now it's my pleasure to introduce you to our speakers today, Barbara MacAdam, Jonathan Little Cohen, Curator of American Art, and Vivian Ladd, Teaching Specialist. Welcome, Bonnie and Vivian.
Thank you. Well, welcome, and thank you for joining us during this challenging time. Let me first say that our thoughts go out to all who have suffered with the coronavirus or experienced the loss of family, friends, or colleagues. We wish you healing and good health. Today, we'll take a close look at our Lilly Martin Spencer painting and explore how it fit into the artist's career during a period of dramatic social and artistic change. We'll be seeing a lot of images of our painting on the left here, but I also wanted you to see it with its complete original frame in the galleries, and also some of the friends it usually lives with. These are works from the 19th century that touch on some aspect of everyday life. Now, one might wonder why we selected this painting to be our focus today. And as you can see, it's rich visual information and rewards close looking. It also sheds light on the time period in which it was made and the triumphs and travails of the artist, who was one of the relatively few female painters of her time to support her family through the sale of her paintings. Fortunately, there's a really rich archive of family correspondence and other documentation that has survived. And as a result, numerous scholars have mined various aspects of her career and explored her place in American art. I'm indebted to their work, especially Robin Bolton Smith and William Treutner, David Lubin, Elizabeth O'Leary, Wendy Katz, and Håkan Virik. Perhaps what intrigues me most about the painting is that it prompts a wide range of reactions. Whether one loves it or not, it is pretty unforgettable, I think. So we'd like to start this program where we typically start when we're investigating art, and that's by taking a close look. And for that, I turn to Vivian Ladd, our teaching specialist, who has mastered a method of close looking.
Good afternoon. The Jolly Washerwoman does indeed reward close looking. This painting is a wonderful opportunity for audiences to look carefully and think critically about how works of art communicate information visually. When we invite audiences to share their observations about this painting, they are often drawn first to the washerwoman's expression. Bonnie's going to be advancing slides for me, so occasionally I'll say next, as if we were looking at an old-time slideshow. Some are charmed and engaged by the washerwoman's expression. Others find it off-putting. Still others find it disingenuous, given the arduous task this woman is engaged in. Obviously, there is the washerwoman's broad, toothy smile, but visitors also notice the way in which her smile engages her whole face, the crinkle in her nose, the twinkle in her eyes. About this woman, there is a sense of hardiness and well-being. Her cheeks are full and rosy. Her hairstyle is immaculate, not a single hair out of place, and not one of them is gray. And for that matter, she has all her teeth, and they are straight and regular. There's an immediacy to this woman's gaze, as if she has been interrupted and just looked up to greet the viewer. Next slide. As we move our eyes through the painting, we notice the strength and heft of her shoulders, the raw red soreness of her forearms. We can study the work and the technology that she's using. She set an article of clothing and her soap upon the washboard and rests her weight heavily on her hands on the edges of the wash tub. Her plain dress is torn under the arm and at the back, and a sheet has been tucked into her waistband as a makeshift apron. Next. Moving on, we notice how carefully she has separated her laundry. She has first washed, rinsed, and wrung out, rather enthusiastically, first the whites and then the light colors. And in this detail in particular, viewers are struck by Lilly Martin Spencer's technical skill. The focus on texture, wood, metal, cloth, wet flesh is extraordinary, as is the charming splash of water on the corner of her workbench. It can be easy to get lost in the details, so we just bring back the full painting for just a moment to reorient you. We're now going to turn our attention to the lower left corner of the painting. Here is what I affectionately call the dry clean only pile. Fine clothing in velvets and satins that have been set aside from the basic washing. There's a little boy's jacket with shiny breast buttons and what appears to be a bulky green velvet cloak. Before our visual inventory is complete, we must turn our attention to the background of the painting. This beautiful detail reveals Spencer's mastery of composition. Here we find the tools of her trade, a bottle, a bucket, a pan with two lids, and a small oval box filled with clothespins, another bar of soap, and perhaps a couple of little cloth fasteners on the left in green. Looking deeper still into the background, we see she is tucked into a space with a chipped brick wall. The entire scene is set within a beautiful arching gold picture frame. There is so much to discuss about this work visually. Next. The quality of light as it rakes over the figure from the left and illuminates her face, her arm, and the workbench. The palette of browns and grays, earth tones, punctuated by touches of pink and gold. The repetition of shapes, especially circles, in the pan and the bucket in the background, her head, the wash tub, the metal bowl. The way in which her workbench pushes into our space and then draws our eye back into the shadows. The scale of this painting isn't large. It's only 32 inches by 26 inches. It's delightful to slow down and simply name all the choices Lilly Martin Spencer has made in this work. And as we do so, we develop a relationship to it, a connection, an intimacy that makes visitors want to learn more. As we explore this painting visually, audiences often wonder about this woman. Who might she be? What can we learn about her based on the painting alone? For instance, where in the world might she be? When might this image have been painted, and for whom? As you already know, the title of the painting is The Jolly Washerwoman, but how would we know that she's a servant without the title? Might she, in fact, be the woman of the household, perhaps a wife and mother, doing her own family's laundry? In order to determine the answer to that question, we look again to the work for clues, and groups in the museum have often debated the merits of both theories. This household seems to have a little boy in it, based on the small jacket in the lower left. It's clearly a 19th century image based on clothing, hairstyle, laundry technology. Given the fineness of that little jacket and what we know of history, it seems more likely that a family who could afford velvets and satins would probably employ a washerwoman. Furthermore, would a woman who owns velvets and satins want to be painted while doing the laundry? Groups tend to settle pretty quickly on the fact that this is in fact a servant and a washerwoman. The strength of her arms imply experience with hard work, the careful rendering and understanding of all that is involved in doing the laundry, the way in which she's nestled into this dark space, all of this suggests that this is a domain that is hers alone. It's curious, though, that based on the specificity of her face, that this painting is a portrait. Why would an artist paint a portrait of a washerwoman? Doesn't that seem unusual? Finally, we've often debated whether this painting is American or European in our explorations in the galleries. There's certainly evidence for both. But one tiny detail, that little oval box with the clothespins, often sways the argument to the fact that this might be an American painting. The box looks as if it were made by Shakers. And if this is in fact an American painting, the probability is that it is set somewhere in the north, perhaps in an urban center, based on the servant's ethnicity, the heaviness of the fabric, of her dress, and the setting. She seems to be in a basement of some sort, a dark space where the plaster is chipped away from brick walls. After this slow, careful looking and analysis, people become very curious about Lilly Martin Spencer and the times in which she lived. So I'm going to turn things over to Bonnie to fill in some context about the artist and her times.
Thank you, Vivian. You do a marvelous job of that. You had me completely in awe. So I think I skipped a slide, sorry. I start this with this image to show that Lilly Martin Spencer was by no means the first artist to paint washerwomen. And there's a long European tradition of painting laundresses, and Spencer was clearly familiar with it. So in each of the paintings here, the centerpiece is the figure, the washerwoman, and each figure is bending over their laundry and looks out at us, though ours is the only one with a toothy grin. The woman on the right has a more coquettish expression. And there are other similarities too. Both the Metsu and the Spencer are framed by an arch and push items toward us into the viewer's space. In this comparison, we see lots of visual markers of class: the clothing, the hairstyle, the jewelry, the parts of the body that are exposed or not. And I think the biggest marker of class really is the expression, the toothy smile. In polite society and in portraiture, the traditional portraiture, only a demure smile would be acceptable, and anything else would indicate that you were of lower class. So what do we know about our sitter? There's not that much, but happily there are two key references. A friend of Spencer's mother wrote to her that she had visited Lilly and was shown in by the servant, who led them into the studio where she and her friend saw this painting. She wrote, "There was one pleasing as well as becoming. It was the servant's likeness, which she took while washing. She, the servant, was looking through the window at the time that something rather attracting and laughable was passing. She called Mrs. Spencer to come and see it. The position of the servant pleased her so well that she thought she must have her likeness. I never saw anything so striking before, for it was the same one that opened the door, so we had a good chance to judge. The bench and clothes, washboard, soap, etc. looked so natural, it seemed as though we might almost pick them up." We also know from the 1850 census that there was a Jane Thompson who was living with the family. She was in her mid-30s and she was born in Scotland. And almost all the domestic workers in New York City at this time had immigrated from Ireland or Scotland, primarily because of the potato famine. Now for Lilly, I'll give you just a bit of background before we focus on her mature career. Both of her parents were from Brittany, France, but immigrated to the US and settled in Marietta, Ohio in 1830. Lilly demonstrated her artistic talent at an early age, and in 1841 moved to Cincinnati, which was really the art center for the Midwest. A year later, she stated her lofty artistic ambitions. I want to try to make all my paintings have a tendency towards moral improvement as far as it is in the power of painting, speaking from those who are good and virtuous to counteract evil. She stayed in Cincinnati for 7 years, during which she exhibited and sold her paintings at the Western Art Union. She also became acquainted with Nicholas Longworth, a prominent local art patron who had an extensive collection, which included several 17th century Dutch paintings that likely made a strong impression on her. While she was in Cincinnati, she married Benjamin Spencer, then a tailor, and they created a very unusual partnership for the time. He started out as a tailor, but then he started to work with Spencer, Lilly, on her art practice. We don't know exactly to what extent, maybe working on backgrounds, maybe framing. And together they had 13 children, only 7 of whom survived to adulthood. Now here's some early drawings from one of her sketchbooks. And you can see at this time she was focusing on children and romantic literary themes, as we see here with the Shakespeare references. And at the bottom is a drawing of one of her deceased children. And it was really quite common at the time to capture the images of the deceased, really quite a common practice. She moved to New York City in 1848 with hopes of a wider market and more opportunities to exhibit her work. She realized that she was less skilled than her competitors and took free evening drawing classes at the National Academy of Design to make amends. She was also distressed to discover how many artists she had to compete with in the city. She wrote home to her mother that, I do not actually get half as well paid for my works as I did in the West and have to do 10 times better work. Genre painting was becoming quite popular at this time, and the best known practitioners exhibiting in New York were William Sidney Mount and George Caleb Bingham. Both of them focused on the male sphere and rural rather than urban subjects. Spencer was fortunate that there was interest in at least a growing market for scenes of domestic life. And since she was housebound with her large family, this suited her very well. As we see here, husbands sometimes make appearances in her work as well. And on the right, we have a man who is probably dressed for business, but notice that he's engaging with the baby. And it's a very formal, elegant setting. There's a French lamp on the mantle, and it looks like there's like a Zouave doll, a soldier doll on the floor. These may be indicating Spencer's heritage. And on the left, we see these happy parents adoring their sleeping children. And the wife is cueing the husband not to disturb them. And as idyllic as this seems, these kinds of paintings or likenesses could be really a reference to the high rate of childhood mortality at the time. So it could evoke death as much as peaceful innocence. And the motif of sleeping children was used on funerary sculpture to a large extent. Most of Spencer's sales came through the American Art Union, which, like its counterpart in Cincinnati, was trying to foster an appreciation of art among a wider audience. At a time when taste was changing and becoming increasingly stratified in terms of audiences, Spencer tried quite desperately to appeal to both ends of the spectrum. And I think we sense that struggle here. On the right, titled Hesitation, this woman has, I think, received a proposal offer, and she is hesitating as she considers it. And of course, there's a great contrast to our Jolly Washerwoman on the left. We happen to know that our painting sold for $240, and Hesitation sold for 110 at the Art Union's last sale. I think we probably can guess which direction she'll be headed from here. And in this regard, I think it's fair to say that our painting marked a turning point in her career. A series of kitchen paintings ensued. All are set in her home. We see the repetition of some of the furniture and kitchenware from one painting to another. That tin basin certainly reminds me of the basin that held white clothes in our painting. Peeling onions to the right is a beautifully composed work. The woman's not smiling. She, in fact, gets our sympathy as her eyes are stinging from the onion she's peeling, or slicing, I think, in this case. Her arms look very strong, suggesting that she's a servant, though it's not completely clear. And there's this gorgeous array of food in the foreground. And interestingly, a spoon's handle extends over the table and into our space. On the far left, Kiss Me and You'll Kiss the Lasses. This reintroduced humor, but in a more refined setting. It was likely Spencer's dining room. And here we see a young woman preserving fruit. She's likely teasing a suitor who is entering the room. If he attempts to kiss her, she'll daub him with this spoonful of molasses. But of course, she's also teasing us. And we might get similar treatment if we were to proceed with the greeting. Spencer likely painted this subject in response to the harsh critique she received for portraying crude, unladylike servants. This mistress is well dressed, in fact, overdressed for the task, and appears to be young and flirtatious. This is a closer look at the one that was in the center, Shake Hands. If we would approach this woman, we would likely be met by her sticky hand covered with dough. The model for this is probably a maid in the household. It was painted 3 years later than our washerwoman, although there are some resemblances. As with the other kitchen subjects, it is remarkable for its level of detail, with everything needed for her task visible. This was probably Spencer's most widely circulated image. There were reproductions in the form of lithographs and engravings that helped to popularize the painting, though Spencer, like other artists, did not really reap much of a financial benefit from such prints. And to the right is a really lovely drawing of her servant, perhaps the one who's in the painting. Note the similarity in the hairstyle. It's a very tender, intimate likeness, very different from the sort of more caricature-like portrayals. Here we see a young husband and a young wife, and both seem to be struggling with their new roles. The husband's basket is overstuffed and the vegetables are falling onto the ground, and it looks like he's about to use the chicken too. And he is being observed by a passerby who finds his dilemma quite humorous. There's also an observer in the painting on the right. There the mistress seems to be somewhat confused by her task at hand, which is making a stew. And the mistress seems potentially confused. She's a little bit more impassive. She's also far less genteel in appearance and behavior. She's chewing on her finger and her apron is heavily soiled. We can't be sure if she's critiquing the mistress's technique or if she too is confused about the task at hand. Spencer exhibited the pair in the 1856 National Academy of Design exhibition. Although they received some positive reviews, the review in the rather high-minded publication, The Crayon, was scathing. Is there in her woman's soul no serene, grave thought, no quiet happiness, no tearful aspiration to the expression of which she may give her pencil? Being a woman, she would have some deeper, tenderer conceptions of humanity than her brother artists, something at all events better worth her painting and our seeing than grinning housemaids or perplexed young wives. Apparently these were popular too, and I've never actually seen reproductions like this in cast metal that depict both of the scenes. Just one on the right probably would hang on a wall, but the others were fit into these very ornate girandelles. So in the image on the right, The painting for this is not located, but the print has survived and circulated. We also see an unflattering view of a servant. The fashionably dressed house mistress enters the dining room, and the table had been, very beautifully covered with all kinds of fruits and treats. Well, the children have gotten into it. The cats are, one's on the table, the other one next to the figure, looking at herself in the mirror. This is clearly the family's servant, and you can even see a neglected feather duster at the bottom, right next to the doll. And apparently she's so engaged in looking at herself and adjusting her collar that she has completely lost control of the setting. This is a later work from 1866, and as you can see, the subtitle is Celebrating the Victory at Vicksburg. What's unusual about this is that we see a woman reading the newspaper. Normally this is something you see the head of the household reading. And we assume that her spouse is off at war. And so she's kind of manning the fort here. She's so engrossed that it looks like the baby's about to fall off of her lap. And the children are having this impromptu celebration, a celebratory parade. But in the distance, we can sort of barely make out a servant. Her dark clothing, her darker complexion makes her almost disappear into the background. And, what is going on with this shift, it seems, where she goes from being quite affectionate towards her Jolly Washerwoman, and now they're much less flattering images. By this time, Lilly, like so many house mistresses, had soured on servants. When she was in financial straits, she couldn't afford them. And when she had them, supervising them took her away from her painting. The service class in New York at that time was made up almost exclusively of Irish or Scottish immigrants who had to adjust from rural settings to city life and to different cultural practices. They were likely unfamiliar with the habits and expectations of aspiring middle-class housewives in New York City. And given the circumstances, it's not surprising that tensions rose owing to cultural differences. There were also not enough servants to meet demand, with many moving away to work in the factories. Also, newspapers and magazines were full of dehumanizing images of Irish at this time. Did Lilly share those sentiments to some degree? Or was she hoping to broaden her market with an audience that was drawn to such racist imagery? I doubt that we'll ever know for sure. In her later years, she continued to make still lifes, usually fairly small still lifes. And we know that she was really a master of the still life genre from the way still lifes appeared in her kitchen series. And she was also making numerous portraits to get by, but there were no more of the kitchen scenes. And yes, this was painted by the same woman who painted our washerwoman. After the war, Lilly Martin Spencer hoped to attract a more elevated audience by painting what she considered to be her masterpiece, Truth, Unveiling, Falsehood, which measured 8 by 6 feet. This is a smaller version made the following year. And this sort of allegorical art was in the air and enabled her to express loftier themes, which had been her original goal, as you'll recall. The painting brought her acclaim, and it was even shown at the 1876 centennial, but she couldn't sell it for the amount she felt it deserved, so it stayed in her studio until her death. So such were the vicissitudes of Spencer's career. She was an extraordinarily talented painter who had to negotiate the expectations and limitations imposed on female artists. Remarkably, she persevered, as she had to in order to support her family. I think we can take pride, however, that our Jolly Washerwoman helped to launch her on a path that earned her reputation as one of the most prominent American female painters of her day. So with that, I think, Vivian, you're going to encourage or propose some questions.
Yes, we've been talking at you now for quite some time, and we'd actually like to send some questions your way, particularly in regards to interpretation or your assessment of our Jolly Washerwoman. So my first question for all of you, and you're welcome to put your comments in the Q&A and we'll share them with the group. We're wondering, how do you think the Hood Museum of Art's painting, the Jolly Washerwoman, compares to other works in Lilly Martin Spencer's kitchen series, like Kiss Me and You'll Kiss the Lasses? Is our painting unique in some way? Do you prefer it? Do you like it less? And why? And while we give you a few moments to consider that and share your responses, I'm going to turn things over to Sharon to maybe pose some questions that might have come along during our presentation.
Thank you, Vivian. I would like to restate, I misspoke earlier, our Q&A feature is not on this one, but if you could please enter your questions into the chat box that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. We're happy to take them from there. We do have a question for Vivian and Bonnie. Who were other contemporary women artists and how did their subjects differ?
You know, there weren't many female artists whose reputation kind of followed them. So actually, I can't even think of any names in the period. There's the later generation, like I think it's Eliza Greatorix. That may not be the first name, but that's really almost a different generation of artists. So it was quite unusual. It would be very difficult for a woman to be running a household and do the painting that Spencer did. And she was lucky to have some help in that regard. And she was determined, you know, she just would not quit. She painted to your last dying day.
Really is worth mentioning again that this is a woman who had 13 children, 7 of whom survived to maturity and maintained an active painting career.
Yeah, it really is unbelievable.
Sharon,
and there were times, I was going to say, there were times when she had no servants, and they were not happy times, but it was a challenge.
It looks like we have a response to your question, Vivian, about how do you feel about our Jolly Washerwoman versus the rest of her kitchen series. We have someone who likes it more because it feels more nuanced, and that before today they had not noticed the rips in her dress and hadn't paid attention to the skill with which Lilly Martin Spencer painted the different materials, the wood, the velvet, the skin, and the wet laundry.
Thank you for that response. I've always been struck by the monumentality of our washerwoman in comparison to this young housewife. And I'm curious, Bonnie, do you feel yourself that our painting stands out in some critical way from the rest of the works in the series, which feel to me a bit more decorative?
Yes, I totally agree. You know, she's much more enclosed. She's closer to the picture plane. So it really is much more about her. We're not as distracted by all the fruit and all the activity, the different patterns, and even looking into another room. It's really much more about her, and it's a very strong composition. It really is quite a masterwork. Again, people either like it or not so much, but you have to, I think, admit that she was quite a technician.
Yeah, we have lots of thoughts rolling in now, responses to those questions. One person notes that they find our Jolly Washerwoman less sentimental than the kitchen works, and therefore they like it better. We have another audience member who feels the Jolly Washerwoman is much more intimate than Spencer's other works, and makes them think that Spencer had a warm, close relationship with the servant, and perhaps that they were sharing a joke of some sort. And we have one more comment. We have several, but I'll let you respond to these after this one, who has developed a greater appreciation for this painting after this discussion. They used to dislike it a bit for its closeness to a certain kind of genre painting, but they see it as less condescending and more sympathetic now. And they do like it better than the ones with the kind of humorous captions, precisely because it liberates itself a bit from the genre painting. They like the immediacy of it and how much she's directly kind of in our face.
Thank you. I'd like for us to respond to a few of those in just a moment, but I would like to pose another question just to extend the conversation. As Bonnie mentioned, prints were made of Lilly Martin Spencer's work that were affordable to the middle classes. We've seen some examples. The paintings, however, would have been purchased by people of some means. I'm wondering about your thoughts about why a wealthy patron would want a painting of a washerwoman in 1851. I mean, certainly a wealthy art collector could purchase a lovely landscape or a still life or a portrait of themselves or another family member. Why would anyone purchase a portrait of someone else's servant in 1851? And while you're thinking about that, maybe Bonnie and I can respond to some of those comments or other questions that have come along.
I do have another question, if you don't mind. We have a question about how do we account for Lilly Martin Spencer's drive to succeed? Because it seems like she changed styles with the times in an effort to capture more of her audience. And we don't usually hear about artists being driven by the market in this way.
I think it happens a lot today too. I mean, people, many artists need the income to survive, and sometimes it can be quite repetitive where a motif kind of appears again and again and again. It may be a very beautiful effect, but there's not a lot of deeper exploration, it seems, that the artist is pursuing. I'm really amazed at her range. The still lifes are extraordinary. She lamented the fact that she didn't have any instruction in landscape painting. And you can see why it would have been difficult, you know, to leave the house with 7 children. And where would she go? How far would she have to travel to paint and sketch what we would call a landscape? But landscape was something that was quite popular throughout that period, from the really mid-19th century on up, and I think that would have been helpful to her. So she could only work within a certain range, I think, because of her training, and also just because of she needed the accessibility to the subject matter. She did a lot of portraits. And, you know, her style later on in life is a little looser. It doesn't have this kind of incredible realism and crispness. And I think she's more successful, actually, in this period. It really shows her strength.
We have what I believe this is a response to your most recent question, Vivian, about why would people purchase this type of painting? And we have someone who is wondering if the popularity of this genre has something to do with showcasing sympathies for the working class at this period in time as a possibility.
Are there other thoughts to kind of against that?
Well, so we have someone else who's noted that wealthy Americans in the mid-1800s were not necessarily landed gentry, and they would generally become wealthy through honest labor, and this painting takes joy in the humble American work ethic.
Yeah, and actually we know the name of the person who purchased our painting, and his name was Jonathan Osborne. And I remember looking through city directories and so forth, and I don't know if this is the Jonathan Osborne, but it was a liquor distributor, essentially. And I have wondered about how this might appear maybe in a store or a place of business, just to engage your audience. People would get a real kick out of it. And I also don't think it was exclusively for the middle class, as you say. You know, it's a very fine painting, and it cost a fair amount of money. You know, $240, I'm sure, was an impressive price that day. So, but where would it hang in a house? Would it hang in the kitchen? Or would it fit in the living room or some other space? It was a little early for man caves, but I think it would be great in that kind of setting.
That's so interesting that you say a man cave when it is in fact a painting of a domestic female sphere.
Yeah. Well, I think it could go that way too. but I think the humor part could appeal to men as much as women.
So that brings me to my last question. And, if we have time at the end, we'll be happy to answer more questions that have come our way. But interpretation is a living thing. This painting would have been understood in a particular way in 1851 by critics and other artists, by the buyer of this painting, even by the servants who might have passed by it every day, either in a shop or past the man cave or in the kitchen. Everyone would have had a different point of view. And I'm wondering from our audience, how do you think our experience of this work is influenced by the times in which we live? How do we see this painting perhaps a bit differently than people might have viewed it in 1851? What message, how do you see the painting and what message does it convey to you? And while you're ruminating, Sharon, have we got a few more questions or comments?
We absolutely do. We have many wonderful questions, so I apologize that we probably won't be able to get to all of them, but we will do our best here. Going back to the previous thought about why a wealthy person might want to purchase this work, yes, the previous thought of sympathy for the working class, but also by way of perhaps distancing themselves and convincing themselves that servants are really quite happy, even though they do all the heavy lifting in the house, that they're happy with what they do. So that's an additional thought. And then we have a question, was Osborne, the purchaser of our painting, possibly familiar with European art of the prior century?
I think that's quite possible. Certainly German painting. There was a Dusseldorf gallery, which was a private collection of old master paintings. And Lilly would have seen that as well, I'm quite sure. But no, I think that's very valid.
And Bonnie, wasn't our painting lost for a time to the
Yes.
Dusseldorf School?
Yes, exactly. So how do I begin? When this painting was offered to us, we learned that it had been rediscovered, after generations of being missing. And a lot of her work is still unlocated. But this smart picker, I guess, really saw right away that this looked like a Lilly Martin Spencer. And there was documentation of this painting. So it matches perfectly the description. But what was interesting about it, that it was assigned as Meyer von Bremen, who was a Dusseldorf artist. And there was a time when American art was hot, or was not hot. European art was popular. And that is the reason why I'm sure that it was, her signature was effaced and then this other signature was added. So tastes change over time.
Okay, so we do have someone with a response to your question about how we today view this painting. We have someone who views this painting as a way to honor and value someone doing any sort of necessary, honest work, and the painting extols the goodness of hard work. So upholding some of our still very American values.
And just to follow up on that, I did notice that somebody had asked about the arched frame. And I know scholarship has varied in their point of view about the arched frame. But for me, I've always seen a sort of apse-like quality. It's almost as if this was the chapel of cleanliness represented in this painting. And I'm not sure whether scholars agree with that interpretation. What are your thoughts, Bonnie?
Well, I read it, very similarly. I have heard that this is a very common frame style from the period, but the impact, I think, is it really emphasizes that monumentality that you mentioned earlier. It gives it a preciousness, which is interesting when you consider what the subject matter is, to have all this gilding surrounding this very workaday situation.
Right, but it does again reinforce that sort of sanctity and nobility of hard work, of any job done well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wonder if we look at it differently today in that we're maybe more aware of the struggles of the working class. And there's like, there's a political dimension here about, was she really that happy working with the family? And what was it like to work with Lilly Martin Spencer as your boss? That she didn't write about that, so we don't know.
I think we have time for one more question before we close out today. Vivian, Bonnie, is there something you'd like to ask, or would you like me to share one of the questions from our chat box?
I'm still curious. I saw some comments about essential workers in our chat box, and I'm curious what people are thinking about that today. Is that too far back?
It might be too far back.
I think some of our response, I've been watching the chat as it pops up, and there does seem to be some sense that there is a connection here between people who do the hard work in our community and the fact that this is a painting that does celebrate that.
It does. We do have someone who said that if someone today was looking at this doing laundry, they might be appalled. Doing laundry on a, oops. Did we lose Bonnie?
I think we might have.
We may have, but it's, I think we're about at time. So Vivian, do you have any closing remarks?
I just want to thank everyone for coming and for sharing their thoughts and their point of view. A work of art is richest from multiple perspectives and points of view. And as we all try and teach on new platforms in these very strange times, I can't thank you enough for the dynamic conversation you all have contributed to. It makes me quite nostalgic for teaching in the galleries where this kind of dynamic interchange happens all the time. I hope many of you will come back to our programs and share as you've done today. It makes the experience all the richer for all of us.
Thank you. And before we sign off, I just want to thank Bonnie and Vivian. We apologize for any technical glitches. For a wonderful program and what we hope either introduced you to the Jolly Washerwoman or shed new light on this work from our collection. You will find a link to a survey in the follow-up email that you will receive tomorrow. We do read through these surveys and make changes where we can because we want to make your experience as rewarding as possible. So we thank you for your feedback. You can register for upcoming programs on the Hood Museum's website, through the events calendar, on the Dartmouth events calendar, or through links provided on our Facebook page. Thank you all for joining us today. We appreciate your continued interest and support, and we wish you a wonderful rest of the week.
Be well.